Hey everybody, welcome into another episode of Outdoor Adventures on Brownfield. I'm Brent Barnett. This week's show is brought to you by Bex. This season, Bex is recognizing student athletes who are not just stars in athletics, but players who show heart in school, at work, in their communities, and in the ag industry. Joining us this week on the program is Jeff Pritzl, Deer Program Specialist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Jeff, thanks for joining us on Brownfield. How are you?
Hey, Brent, I'm doing great. Looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, and our topic this week is going to be about the white deer herd in Wisconsin. And we're talking about whitetail deer, but white deer specifically. And we'll come to learn throughout this podcast about the number of all white deer that are in the state, and excited to learn more. First, Jeff, can you tell the listeners more about you and your role with DNR and where your passion for the outdoors comes from? You
bet. Yes. I've been a wildlife biologist for Wisconsin DNR now for 34 years full time, and I worked for them seasonally a little bit while I was in college. And I grew up in central Wisconsin. My grandfather was my mentor in all things outdoors, hunting and fishing. And I grew up, fortunately, pretty close to University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, which has a college dedicated to natural resources careers. And so I had my eyes set on that when I was a freshman in high school, and it all came together, and I ended up working for the department, except for 35 years. Not as a deer specialist. I was just a general wildlife biologist most of my career. And then I was a supervisor for a good part of the second half of my career in the Green Bay area. And deer just became a bigger and bigger part of all my everyday conversations. And so the opportunity to step in and help shepherd the deer program here towards the end of my career, was an opportunity I took. I've been doing that now for 4 years. And so then, as part of that, this issue of white deer in Wisconsin is kind of become an issue, so that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'm curious, I grew up hunting background, fishing background in my childhood from Missouri, northwestern Missouri, have lived in Iowa now for a decade. And obviously hunting is really big here. Can you give the listeners some quick background on just how important deer hunting and just hunting in general is to Wisconsin residents?
Yeah, it's a part of the fabric of our culture, like it is in a lot of Midwest states. But Wisconsin, very specifically, had a real blossoming of an interest in deer hunting post World War II, and that was just a number of factors, that came together that really allowed the deer population to flourish, and then people taking advantage of that and really growing. And so we saw this arc of growth and interest in hunting and deer hunting that peaked at the turn of the century. So back in the year 2000, we had about 700,000 deer hunters in Wisconsin. And it's as is happening all over the country, it's kind of coming down from that just because of human population demographics, et cetera. But But I've seen over the course of decades where, our gun deer season, which in Wisconsin is a 9-day season centered around Thanksgiving, weekend before and the weekend after, was almost treated as a state holiday. Schools shut down, schedules are altered because enough of our population would be out deer hunting. And that has shifted now because people like deer hunting. It shifted from that concentrated effort during a week for gun deer hunting, and now we've got 300,000 hunters that are archers as well, and they hunt from middle of September, till the midwinter, and so a little less emphasis on that gun season, but we've got 300,000 people that right now are entering into the best part of the archery season. And so, there's a lot and it drives some economy in terms of, merchandise and product and travel, and certainly just a lot to talk about. And deer hunters are passionate about, that. And so they like to get together, and it used to be more in person, but now there's a lot of course, social media chatter and places to do that, and platforms. And so, and I enjoy that part of it. I enjoy talking about and bringing up the issues, and hopefully helping to straighten out a few things that might be perceptions that aren't real reality, but that's part of the fun of it is kind of talking about that stuff, dealing with some of the passions and the angst, and hopefully putting people in a position that they can go, okay, I understand. I see why that plays out the way it does now, and help them enjoy their hunting experience.
You mentioned social media. It never fails. Anytime throughout the year, I always come across either Facebook or Instagram photos of people seeing the white deer in Wisconsin. It could be, they were driving down the road and they got a photo of one with their phone, or trail camera pictures that are put out there. Jeff, why are white deer so prevalent in Wisconsin, and which areas do we mostly see them there?
Yeah, there's a few areas that we would call, I guess you'd say, hotspots that we've seen develop over the last 10 to 15 years. But the history of white deer in Wisconsin is, from a regulatory standpoint, goes all the way back to that 1940s, post World War II era, where just because of the randomness of genetic mutations, and whether a lot of people want to distinguish, we think about white being albino, but most of the deer are not technically albino. They're just what we refer to as leucistic, which means they do have that color genetic malnormity that causes their fur to be white, but they don't have the pink eyes and the nose and all that kind of stuff. It's just that their fur is white. And there was a group of white deer that became known up in northern Wisconsin as a tourist destination area. It was already, and those deer became part of that tourism attraction, and that caused the state to pass a law to protect those white deer. Little did they imagine, decades and decades ago, that as it stands now, we'd have over 2 million deer on the landscape throughout Wisconsin. And that sheer volume of deer means you've got more opportunities for these genetic variations to happen. And it just so happens that because they've been protected in a few areas, they've really started to proliferate to a point where it's no longer a novelty and a rare thing. So a number of years ago in 2020, we started a public campaign to collect reports of white deer across the state. And it quickly developed some stuff we already kind of knew about from reports, but right smack dab in the middle of Wisconsin, in a 3-county area, what we've really seen in the last 10 to 15 years is a growth in white deer, to the point where some landowners are saying, I've got as many white deer as I have brown deer on my landscape. And we, in another area in east central Wisconsin along Lake Winnebago, is another hotspot. And then there's another area in southeast Wisconsin. But since 2020, we've documented white deer in 36 counties of our 72 counties. And so that notion of how rare they are has changed somewhat, because there's, in some parts of the state, it is still a novelty, and it is still quite rare, but there's a few areas in the state where it's gotten to the point where it's got people questioning whether we should continue to protect them, because it's just encouraging this anomaly to be, becoming, more common, to the point where some landowners and hunters are starting to feel it's interfering with their ability to either manage the deer herd on their property, or in the case of agricultural producers, even if they're participating in Wisconsin, if they're receiving enough crop damage, they could be eligible for extra permits. But those white deer, if they're not are not eligible, it hampers their ability to achieve their harvest objectives, to keep that deer herd in control.
How do you guys assess the feedback you receive from landowners, residents, hunters? Do you take that in, and do you bring back into consideration those restrictions at all?
Yeah, so our laws in Wisconsin are either embedded in state statute with the legislature, or what we call administrative code, which is under the purview of our commission. In Wisconsin, we call it a natural resources board, but it's in our administrative code language that white deer are protected. And so in the future, if that were to change, it would have to go through a rule public engagement process by which eventually our state commission would approve a change in that rule. And there's been some discussion about doing that, but it's a long, slow process. We also have in Wisconsin, every county has a deer advisory council. And so those councils meet once a year to talk about various issues. And so through the input at those county council meetings, we also get feedback as to, hey, these are the counties that white deer have transitioned from being a rare novelty to a concern of, hey, they're not being managed as part of the deer herd.
It's interesting, some of the photos you see, it's not just does. I mean, I've seen some pics of some pretty nice bucks with the all white bodies.
Yeah. Well, and that's really this is much more of a social issue than a biological issue. And yeah, most of the stories revolve in a white big buck is still an eye-catching, unique specimen that becomes locally a celebrity. And then there becomes the issue of, and you can have this happen with normal brown colored deer too, right? If they're an exceptional specimen, but if that animal gets harvested, it gets, either it gets celebrated by some people and others really find it, to be a travesty. And so it just creates this conflict from that standpoint. We actually did have during a period of time when chronic wasting disease first got established in Wisconsin, and we had a really aggressive program locally to try to reduce deer densities. We did have white deer in that area come off of the protected list, and they were eligible to be harvested. And what ended up happening, there was a particular pretty nice white buck that was well known in the neighborhood, and it got legally harvested, but it generated a lot of negative, pushback in that community, which ultimately led to us removing that special exemption, and white deer protection, came back across the entire state.
Is it similar in other states, Jeff? This issue of white deer. I'm not sure which states have them, but I was just curious if there are other restrictions out there in other states. Yeah,
it's interesting, and this does point out how social of an issue it is, as far as whether it's been generated through rulemaking processes. And next to us, east and west, Minnesota and Michigan have no special restrictions. White deer are not protected; they're just treated as any other deer. And whether that has not allowed, a little pod of white deer, genetics to get rolling or not, I don't know about that. But on the other hand, Illinois has very similar laws to Wisconsin in protecting white deer, and Iowa, not only do they protect all white deer, but there's another kind of the halfway between is what we call piebald deer that can have, a mixture of white and brown fur. Piebald deer in Wisconsin are not protected. If they do have some brown fur on them, they're legal. But in Iowa, if they're more than 50% white as a piebald deer, they're protected. And so every state treats it a little differently.
One thing I wanted to follow up on that you mentioned earlier, you said these are white deer, but not albino. What's the difference there, just for folks that are curious?
It's simply a different genetic differences in terms of that. The word's escaping me, but they can be albino, which means they're totally missing the pigments that create color, and that includes the eyes and the nose, and that's your classic albino. And there's thoughts that what comes along with that also is other health concerns, that animal is not as, doesn't have the vigor, that a normal deer would have. But in the case of most of them, they have genetically, they have no pigment in their fur, but they have normal pigment for their eyes and nose and hooves and that type of thing. And then that can happen in other species. We see that, for example, you see that a lot in birds, like in poultry, how easy it is for, turkeys and chickens and even pheasants to be genetically, altered to be white as opposed to colored. It happens in other wildlife as well. And so the general term, if they're white, it's what's called leucism, because of loose being the Latin word for white, as opposed to melanistic, which is the black, which is the other end of the spectrum. And people see that, for example, like in squirrels, gray squirrels, there's a lot of gray squirrels that have the black color phase, which is melanism versus leucism. And so that's just the genetic aspect of the color phases.
Jeff, how important is it for Wisconsin DNR to continue that education and put the information out there about white deer and the protections that they have, considering the number of non-resident hunters that come to the state and might come across one?
Yeah, well, we certainly expect that, all hunters, even non-residents, are reviewing our regulations book of all things on an annual basis. And in those regulations books, we of course, if we do make changes, that usually gets highlighted. But it's been a long-standing thing for decades. And so it usually doesn't come up as an issue as far as that protection, that white deer are protected. Everybody, seems to be pretty well aware of that. And now it's getting even more attention in those hotspot areas where it is being questioned as to whether or not it should continue as protection. But and we are very much a public engagement and public input driven, policy state. And so from our perspective, we just collect the information to share to help make informed decisions going forward. And so we kind of just stay neutral on it, but we put the information out there. And at some point in time, it will be public engagement that shapes whether or not the rules, change in the future.
One last question I had for you, Jeff. Reproduction of white deer. Is there any data or research out there that you guys have examined? Like, does the white deer population only reproduce and have white fawns? Or can they have, your regular white-tailed deer with the brown fur as well?
Sure. We have not done any specific research on that because that how would that inform or change our decisions? Not really. But just anecdotally from what we've seen, it's that genetics 101 aspect of, if you think about it in terms of like breeding Labrador puppies, black labs versus yellow labs, depending on the mix of the sire and the dam, you could have a yellow female that throws, a mixture, or they might be all black or vice versa. So you can have a white doe that oftentimes they'll have twins and one will be white and one will be brown. Or, you can have any combination depending on what genetics the male and the female brought in at conception.
Yeah, all really interesting. Thanks so much for coming on the show here this week to talk about Wisconsin's white deer herd. How can our listeners get more information from Wisconsin DNR?
Well, we try to keep a robust website going. We have deer pages that are deer hunting and deer management, deer health related. We don't have anything specifically dedicated to white deer. We do have a wildlife observation form that people participate, and that's where we get most of our information now is people submit observations of what we have a specific category, and we ask people to submit their white deer observations so that we can track the prevalence, and especially any new areas, any place where we have not yet documented them.
Jeff Pritzl is the deer program specialist with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Jeff, thanks for joining us today on Brownfield.
You bet, Brent. My pleasure.
I'm Brent Barnett here with the Outdoor Adventures podcast. Thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend and get outdoors.